Welcome to the Uptown Community Podcast, where we see what we can learn, who we can get to know, and if we can understand each other and our neighborhood a little bit more.
We make up a brilliant tapestry. By examining the various threads and aspects of our community, we can appreciate how each and every person contributes in their own unique way.
What follows is a message given at the Buddhist Temple of Chicago on February 28th, 2021. All right, thanks for having me. I'm going to talk about Preston Bradley and some of his legacies and why I'm pretty involved in why I'm familiar with him. My name's Ben, and I continue to attend here at the temple and at People's Church, where Preston Bradley was a longtime pastor. And I consider myself Buddhitarian. That's Buddhist and Unitarian. So I continue to go to both of those places. I'll try to be as accurate as possible in talking about Preston Bradley, but part of the difficulty in that is there's so many different things that he did, and so if you think about all the different things, tendency for some of the records is to become more or less folklore. I think one of the most outrageous was that Jimmy Hoffa would drop him off to church before Jimmy Hoffa would do his union and or mob-affiliated activities. The most obvious thing that we know is that he was involved with a building down at 941 West Lawrence here in Uptown Chicago. He is responsible for bringing the People's Church to the neighborhood where it is now in Uptown. He was shopping around when he was the pastor of People's Church and trying to find a new location in Chicago for his progressive church. Some of the other things Preston Bradley did was he marched with both Jane Addams and Dr. Martin Luther King at different times. He was a contemporary of FDR, and some sources say advisor. And I guess from one of the recordings that FDR was the only president that Preston Bradley voted for. There was a couple of reports of drafting Preston Bradley as mayor. The building currently Preston Bradley Center is such a big building, it's hard to imagine it was just for one church. Today, the Preston Bradley Center is home to the People's Church, a shelter called Northside Housing, and two other churches, as well as artist communities and other artistic endeavors like theater, dance, and music. Reverend Patty continues to build off the legacy from Preston Bradley by continuing the Interfaith Sundays based on the traditions of the pulpit exchange from Preston Bradley. And there are many different legacies from Preston Bradley. There might be a Curious City episode in the future. The podcast and radio show from WBEZ here in Chicago, one of the producers of the show was talking to me, and I had forgotten about the guiding light, which was supposedly based on Preston Bradley. That's one of the longest running soap operas. I think it made the jump from radio drama to television. I'm sure most of you know about his connection with the libraries and Preston Bradley Hall in the Cultural Center. The Cultural Center was the big central library, and Preston Bradley was on the library board and fundamental to saving the libraries in Chicago. I don't know what exactly he did, but that was a quote from somebody, and maybe just folklore. But the legacy I'm really concerned with is his broadcasting career. He would record his sermons from the People's Church and broadcast those throughout Chicago and surrounding areas. But there was this other project on another radio station that was just 5 minutes, very secular type inspirational messages. And that's why I'm going through these recordings to put them on the Uptown Community Podcast. I'm the founder and creator of that, and that's where I really use those short 5-minute messages. I get at ideas of community and honoring members of the community. It seems to be a different idea for a podcast, not focusing on interest groups like comedy or sports or politics, but a geographic community. If you're not here physically in the building, you might forget that this beautiful temple is in a beautiful neighborhood called Uptown. It was actually here in the temple that I first said out loud that Uptown, this neighborhood, has so much interesting history and so much cool people and so much going on. It should have a podcast. And so I mentioned that to a couple of people at People's Church, and they said, that's a great idea. They didn't really know how I should do that, and I should just figure that out. And as it just so happens that as People's Church has become smaller and occupies less space, there's extra storage spots. And I picked a closet for a studio, and it happened to be the same spot Preston Bradley would use to store his recording equipment and broadcasting equipment. On a promotional video I was doing for fundraising for the podcast, I wanted to say Al Capone who, and instead cast Preston Bradley as kind of a founding father of Uptown. I want to preserve the memory of Preston Bradley, and as some of you know, the building that is owned by People's Church is being sold, and I think there's some real reason for optimism. But every time there's a shift, I think there's an opportunity to preserve what was there. It's mostly been unchanged. Obviously, a lot has changed, but the building has been owned by People's Church for almost 100 years. It's interesting to think everything that has happened and in that building. The biggest theme of the podcast is understanding. So I'm understanding people in the Uptown neighborhood, and I use this method of understanding and apply that to these little short messages that Preston Bradley had recorded. Most of those recordings come from some tapes that were discovered at the Preston Bradley Center that had pencil markings from WLOO, a once radio station in Chicago. There was not a whole lot of other markings of when those were originally recorded, but some of those tapes have years from the late 70s and early 80s. I think that's actually when WLOO was going out of business, so they had returned them back to People's Church. So the box that was discovered was filled with cassette tapes, and I digitized those and put them in my computer. I isolate individual inspirational messages. More of Preston Bradley is on the Illinois Digital Archives, but you have to sift through. There are some sermons, some by Preston Bradley and some by other people, and they're pretty disorganized. So with this newly discovered collection of cassette tapes, I have the opportunity to make my own catalog. I've gotten ideas of some of the bigger ideas I get just by the frequency of times that I hear themes and notice certain patterns. What seems applicable to Buddhism is a term from Preston Bradley used in different than Buddhism. I appreciate every time terms are analyzed. Some of the original text from Buddhism was originally translated as suffering. The term is analyzed and updated by Reverend Patty, and I think Preston Bradley is saying something similar when he uses the term worry. That is, a lot in his writings and recordings, sermons and lectures, some of the things that Preston Bradley had lived through were the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, Vietnam War, and so there was a lot of reason for worry, and he saw a lot of worry go on at that time. I don't think there's any one thing that is a theme, but there's a defense of humanity, an almost stubborn belief in humanism was another idea similar to Buddhism. The most recent time I heard this was included in a collection of records found by Pastor Rudra, the current pastor at People's Church. He found some records and he wanted those digitized. And while I was digitizing some of my tapes, one of the records is Selling Your Best Self, actually from a Businessman of the Month series. So they had him record something there, and it was actually more about embracing your full potential, being full, complete person who, and that would lead to success. I first knew about this philosophy as humanism, and I have seen that idea when I began getting exposed to Eastern religions, Taoism and Buddhism, finding a path, continuing on a path, and embracing your true self without the burden of worry. I'll wrap it up. I hope to come back and talk about some of the other ideas of Preston Bradley and talk about some of the experiences I have on the podcast and in this neighborhood of Uptown. You can subscribe to the Uptown Community Podcast if there's a listening platform you like, or you can hear all the episodes on the website, uptowncommunitypodcast.com. You can sign up for a newsletter. You can support the podcast by donating at the website, and you can contact me through the website. I have a wide range of conversations, and those usually include people that lived or have lived in Uptown or contribute or have contributed to Uptown. One of the first episodes was with Reverend Patty, and you can find that on the website. An inclusive vision is the mission of the podcast. That includes all types of people contributing to conversation, and as I say on the podcast, understanding each other and our neighborhood a little bit more. Thank you. Thank you to Reverend Patty and the Buddhist Temple of Chicago. The Buddhist Temple of Chicago broadcasts their services on Facebook Live every Sunday at 11 a.m. Central Time.
As a project of People's Church, the Uptown Community Podcast celebrates creativity, love, and humanity.
The Uptown Community Podcast is supported with a grant from the Unitarian Universalist Funding Program.